All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, 1896, on October 1st, 5 men on horseback set out to deliver mail along 10 miles of rugged terrain near the Blue Ridge Mountains in West Virginia. They would visit the countryside and farms near places like Charlestown and Halltown and Uvilla. This was the beginning of what was known as Rural Free Delivery, a mail service from the U.S. government for people who lived outside of towns and cities, which at the time was a huge part of the U.S. population and would continue to be. Rural Free Delivery connected farmers and others in rural areas, led to the further integration of the postal service into American lives. It eventually kind of meant that there needed to be better roads and other transportation to rural parts of the country, had a big effect there. It was also, no surprise, a bit of a political and financial football, a laudable goal, but not without controversy, and a lot of people backing it were really in it to line their own pockets, including, you're about to meet quite the character, folks, Postmaster General John Wanamaker. But this is a really interesting moment. It goes far beyond just those 10 miles along the Blue Ridge Mountains. Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I don't know if you did this, but I went and looked up exactly what part. It's like near Harper's Ferry. It's like kind of in that little Maryland, West Virginia nexus. But anyway, so that's what we're talking about. Very beautiful, very rural. But, you know, how did people get their mail before someone on horseback and then later on in car came to their farm and gave them their mail? What would they have to do?
They would have to make a long trek, depending however far they were. Could be a few miles, could be hundreds of miles, to the biggest city and go to the postmaster located there to get their mail. So people are not getting their mail daily. They're not even getting it weekly. Oftentimes it's weeks or even months before you go to pick up your mail. Maybe when you have like a big shopping run to do, you run into town to pick up numerous things and you make it a one-stop shopping trip. But it was not easy getting your mail. It was not something that you did often because it was costly.
Yeah.
It was costly, and depending on how far out you lived, it could be an all-day thing to go into town. It could be a couple-day things to go into town, depending on how far out you were. And so even though you had these post offices that in many ways were the infrastructure of the federal government, they knit the country together. But for most Americans, they didn't live that close to the post office. So it really was an event to go pick up your mail.
Yeah. There was some reporting at the time of a farmer in Missouri. You know, this is quickly spread throughout the rest of the country beyond West Virginia. But a farmer in Missouri calculated that in 15 years, he'd traveled 12,000 miles going to and from his post office to town, you know, basically to get his mail. And, you know, the logic at the heart of all this is pretty simple. It's like, why have 50 people have to trek into town to get their mail when you could just send one person out to deliver mail? But, you know, there's the logic and there's the implementation, and this was not cheap, and it was the end of the day, a little inefficient because it's like we're going to spend government money to send people out into the middle of nowhere where they're going to spend most of their day just traveling, between these isolated towns. And so I suppose that's where there really was a fair amount of controversy and pushback.
What's mind-boggling to me is that if you consider in 1800, 94% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas. You fast forward to 1890, like 65% of the country is still in rural areas. Even by 1900, more than half, 60% of the country is still in rural areas. So we're not, the idea of everyone living in a metropolis or a big city is just, very far from average. So it really does take a lot of people to do this work for more than half the country.
And it's at a time that the federal government is just still pretty small. It's only been a couple of decades at this point that you've had a national currency. There isn't an income tax. There isn't an infrastructure of the federal government that stretches out across the nation, except for these post offices. So now you're putting in this investment so that the federal government can reach into people's homes. And it's an incredible thing to do, but raising the money for it and also just building out the federal government is something that was controversial in the 19th century and will continue to be in the 20th.
And building out roads, building out bridges, the infrastructure. I think we don't appreciate all of the infrastructure that goes with delivering the mail. If you are in a rural environment in which there is no you're on dirt roads, or weather is also a huge factor in this as well. If it's raining, if it's snowing, you're gonna have to wait till spring to get that package. It's gonna take a while. There's no prime.
And I think we can talk about this in a bit, but as you move into the 20th century, there's an argument to be made that it's the need to deliver the mail that really leads to the push for infrastructure connecting the rural parts of the country. But in this moment, in the late in the early to mid 1890s, the idea initially comes out. Well, first off, we should say 1860s is when you kind of get free city delivery. And actually, we should do an episode on that because that's when all these houses have to put numbers on their house, which is really interesting. And so we should do an episode about that. But then, 1860s, 70s, 80s, there's mail in the city. You have these post offices. 1890s, there's this idea, let's connect this to the rural parts of the country. Let's go down some of the objections. I mean, one was just, where's the money going to come from? And so it's a congressman from Georgia initially proposes this. It takes a few years to implement. It finally gets implemented in West Virginia, as we said, because a representative from West Virginia basically scares up $40,000 and says, let's do a little test in these towns. And so they do it there. A lot of the big pushback comes from businesses in cities who say, Kellie, as you were pointing out, a lot of our business has to do with the fact that a rural farmer makes their weekly or bi-weekly trip into town to pick up their mail, and then they shop at our store, they look at our catalogs, they, so forth, and they buy their equipment. And a lot of our business is related to the fact that, yes, we have to drag people into town. And so a lot of the opposition here was from kind of business owners.
Yeah, from business owners as well as competitors. There were paid private delivery companies that you could contract with. And so there's a lot of commercial interest in opposition to the federal government doing something for free. This is going to be the case, again, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. But there really is this idea that if you disrupt the way people do things, you're going to disrupt all of the businesses that were built around the way that people do things. And so there is this resistance to it, but there is so much demand. Once people get a taste of rural free delivery, they're like,
oh, that 2-day shipping.
Give me that good mail.
Well, and moreover, there is the fear, obviously, from existing businesses of this is going to change how we've been doing business. But then quickly there's a realization that, there's a whole new business here to be had. And I think this is where we can walk Postmaster General John Wanamaker onto the stage. And I should know this as the closest. I'm not really from Philly, but I sort of claim I am. And Wanamakers, if I'm mispronouncing it, Philly listeners, I apologize. It's a big department store in Philly. And so this person, if people know this name, they probably know it because of the department store. And it's not a coincidence that we have a postmaster general who also owns a department store and starts to put two and two together and say, you know what? There's the ability here to sell my goods to people in rural areas. It's been really hard to get to these customers. And, this guy, John Wanamaker, is just, on the one hand, he's the postmaster general while this is all happening and is really sort of overseeing a real important initiative. He is really in it for himself. And so, he persuades Congress at one point to pass an act prohibiting the sale of lottery tickets through the mail. And then he goes after them to collect the fines to line his own pockets. He fires 30,000 postal workers and then rehires them. He commissioned, at one point, this isn't really related to this scheme, but at one point he commissioned a series of stamps that apparently were just really terrible. And everyone was like, these are incredibly low quality. What are you doing? He's giving contracts to business partners. The postal employees had a uniform and he got a new uniform contract with a different person who happened to be a buddy of his. He is really, really in it for himself. And he's the one who probably first sees this angle of the catalog, the department store. And, that becomes obviously a major story that these rural parts of the country now are receiving through the mail, not just correspondence, but it becomes this enormous economic engine. And, years later, we get the Sears catalog and all that stuff, and we get sort of
have we done an episode on this? I don't know how political it is, but those catalogs.
Oh, yeah. No, we haven't. But, yeah.
Everything. I mean, they're transformative, transformative.
Last summer, I went to Death Valley, California. I actually was there on the hottest day. Did I tell you this? I was there on the hottest day on recorded history. It was 124 degrees.
Whew,
I just happened to be there. But I'm in Death Valley. It doesn't get more rural than that, right? And one of the houses in this little town that I was visiting was a Sears catalog house.
Oh,
that,
cool.
In 1914 or something, someone had ordered the Sears catalog, which was delivered there it wasn't called the rural free delivery at that point, but was delivered there in the mail. They picked out their house in the catalog. It got sent. And, 100 years later, it's still standing there in this little desert town.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy. I just remember the ginormous Encyclopedia JCPenney catalogs that my aunt used to have. And it was looking for Christmas toys or whatever, going through those catalogs were everything. But I think about how many boxes had to be delivered, how much freight you would have to carry in order to make all of these deliveries, especially when catalogs became a thing. You're carrying even more packages, even more goods. Theft is also an issue too. You have to think about the fact that, postmasters were armed oftentimes because they didn't want to risk losing their product. There's a lot at stake in this endeavor.
Yeah, and this is before there's federal highway system. So one of the things that you see that Jody hinted at earlier is that towns would have to actually apply to get rural-free delivery. They would have to prove that they had sufficient roads for mail deliverers to come to people's homes, and oftentimes they didn't have them. And when they were denied, then the locality would have to raise the money to create the roads to make it possible. And this really does build out the infrastructure of roads in the United States in an era before the federal highway program.
Yeah. And just to map a little bit of that sort of demand and just the growth of this, we're talking here about 1896, where it first gets implemented in West Virginia. By the next year, there's 82 routes across the country. Within a few years, basically, the entire country as it existed then was being serviced in this way. By 1905, there were 32,000 rural free delivery routes, and there were thousands and thousands of petitions from towns around the country. And then eventually it gets folded into, by 1913, is what's known as the parcel post. And that's kind of how that's part of it's not called rural free delivery anymore. It's just an expectation. That's what the post office does, is it delivers to all the different parts of the country. One just little thing I'll point out, is there are people here trying to line their pockets for sure. But in the conversation around all this, there isn't, I'm a little surprised that there isn't a sort of big conversation about is the post office making money? What is the cold calculus here? And I just want to highlight that in recent years that has become a thing that we have Trump putting in a postmaster to Joy, and the Joy talks in sort of these very clear this is a for-profit business kind of things. And I think it's a reminder that not everything needs to make money, especially some parts of government don't need to make money. And you shouldn't look at the post office and be that's where the we're going to make a lot of money, and in my opinion. And so this is a nice reminder that there are other reasons to have a post office.
Well, in fact, the reason the federal government does many things in rural areas, first this and then rural electrification in the 1930s, is because it doesn't make financial sense for a business to do it, because it's such a big country. There are so few customers per square mile. And so this is the kind of public service and public good that a federal government exists for. And so, of course, if it were easy to make money doing this, a private company would have done it. But it wasn't. So the government did it. What are governments for?
All right.
That's what I was going to say.
As we wrap up.
Sounds about right.
As we wrap up, a couple post office facts, because I went to facts.usps.com, one of my favorite websites, because I was just trying to get a sense.
It's my homepage, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to get a sense of like what are the most rural places now, that we deliver mail, and there's all these like facts about the most rural post offices, often on like those little islands off of Alaska or whatever. But the longest rural delivery route is in Clarinda, Iowa, where the carrier every day has to travel 184 miles and deliver 234 boxes. Can you imagine that being your route? Whereas
imagine your gas bill.
I once asked I live in Brooklyn. I once asked my mail guy, like, what's your route? And he's like, oh, it's this block and the next block over. Like, it just takes a whole day to just do 2 blocks, right? But this person drives 181. Man. The shortest rural delivery route, which I guess I don't know how this is defined, but I guess it's rural, but it's 2.3 miles. So somehow that's still part of rural delivery, but it's just a little 2-mile jaunt, and you deliver the boxes. Now, final fact, fun, we'll see. But because I went to facts.usps.com and I searched the word rural, and 2 facts about rural delivery popped up. But then one fact that included the word rural popped up that is not about rural delivery, but it is this fact, and is under the headline on the United States Postal Service website. The headline is, "Parents sometimes mailed their children." And this is a story. This is a story.
Kellie's getting ideas.
This is a story about the year of 1913 on the official United States Postal Service website, that a few weeks after parcel post began, so 1913, Jesse and Matilda Beagle mailed their 8-month-old son James to his grandmother, who lived a few miles away near Batavia, Ohio. Baby Beagle was just under the initial 11-pound limit for parcels.
Oh my God!
Tiny baby.
And rural carrier Vernon Lytle picked up the baby from his grandparents' house, put it in a box, carried him in his mail wagon to his grandmother's house. The postage was 15 cents. And
You're kidding.
And they insured the parcel for $50. So at least they showed a little respect.
Like a little life insurance policy.
I love it.
It's
I love it.
cheaper than an airplane.
It's like,
I mean, what in the world?
I mean,
that's insane.
You're sitting there. You live in. I mean, there's not much going on in Batavia, Ohio, and now all of a sudden you have parcel post. What are you going to do? A couple weeks later, let's see what we can mail.
We'll see what happens. It's just our 8-month-old. It's
I'm
fine.
So disturbed.
Incredible.
I'm so disturbed.
Well, 8-month-old.
Can I just say, as a final pitch, it's so important we take care of our mail carriers, and every year I give our mail carrier my kids' leftover Halloween candy.
Oh, that's
I leave
a good
it in
one.
the mailbox. And I'm like, happy Halloween. My kids are upset by that. But whatevs. They don't need all that sugar. And it's my way of doing, small acts of kindness.
Well, and you also live in a pro-pot state. So if you wanted to sneak in some Halloween edibles,
oh, wow.
I'm sure it would be appreciated by your mail carrier.
You might not get your mail the next day, but yes.
That's right. It might just arrive much more slowly.
I need him to be on time.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode about rural free delivery. And we got a couple others now on the list, which will be good. Mm-hmm. But we haven't done enough postal service stuff. But
yeah, let's do it.
All right. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
All right.
Radiotopia.